Hello and welcome to the show. I'm real excited about tonight's show. Once again, Jacques Vallée joins us. This time, it's going to be about his latest book, Forbidden Science 6. That's his the journals between 2010 2019, and we're going to be talking about that and so much more. And so this show is a pre-recorded show, and after following this at 8 o'clock. Eastern will be John Kiriakou, who I actually interviewed back in 2017 about his CIA whistleblowing that ended up getting him in big time trouble. That was on waterboarding. But anyway, he had a USO amazing encounter. We're going to be talking about that with him later on. But for right now, I'm again very excited to bring in our guest, the one and only Jacques Vallée. Hello, Jacques.
Hello.
And welcome, and you're in sunny San Francisco.
We're almost neighbors. You're just across the bridge.
Yep. I was in Tiburon, as I mentioned, for 9 years. It's so beautiful, that whole area. And
yes.
San Francisco is a wonderful cultural place. I was involved in a antiques. It was called the a North American Decorative Arts Association. We had these amazing meetings at the museum there. Great stuff going on in that city.
It's a wonderful city because it cannot expand outside of that peninsula. So it has escaped all the bad problems of very large American cities with lots of freeways all over the place. You can live here without a car practically.
Yes, and you can't get north where I used to live in Marin from, like, say, the airport unless you go through the city. There's no highway going through it. You have to go through and get there when you get there. But it's really I have a friend that lived in the Sunset District, and he told me he would go an entire summer and only see the sun once, and pretty depressing. The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. that whole Mark Twain saying.
Well, you can just go 20 miles south and it's 15 degrees warmer. So you have a choice of climates. I still in my car to go see Dr. Nolan at Stanford once in a while. So
yep. And that's a pretty campus. I used to actually do benefit auctions there. I had that was a lot of fun. A very nice area as well. But it's very warm there. You're right. Quickly. And I do miss the area. I'm going to be back there in a couple of weeks. Going to be actually interviewing a Berkeley professor that he's going to be teaching a course on UFOs. And I'm going to be in San Rafael live with him there. And then I'm off to speak at that UFO Con, which is the first part of April in San where is that? It's right where the airport is.
Very good.
Burlingame. That's it. Anyway, so that'll be fun to be out there again and enjoy the beautiful weather. So this book is number 6, volume 6, and boy, is it there's a lot involved. You have a very busy life. I know you do so many other things, but and I listened. I have to tell you, I listened to a good part of the Joe Rogan, interview that you did, and I thought that was, fascinating when you get into topics kind of off but related. But and also Hal Puthoff, he mentions that and how fascinating. I've always wanted to meet Hal. So I'm going to start off with a kind of a difficult question because it's been posed to me. And when I was in Washington, D.C. a few months ago, are you hearing me clearly, more or less?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So when I was in Washington, D.C., I had someone that I would consider a skeptic, but, I wouldn't call him a debunker typically, but he came up to me and he said that all UFO crash retrievals, all those stories about recovered craft, everything dead ends at Hal Puthoff. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Of course, there are topics here that cycle through time, that come back again and again and again. And UFO crashes is one of those subjects. Over the years, the reason I continue this journal is that there are very few references that look at time, at things that have happened, since the 50s, and I think we need to preserve that record. And the stories of crashes, go back to actually to 50 years, and there is a lot of bad data about it, and stories and weird tales, but there is also information underneath that has been gathered from people talking around different laboratories, different universities, and so on. And both two subjects are linked here, both the subject of the crashes and the subjects of creatures, seen in connection with it. So Roswell has emerged as one of the test cases, and but Roswell has problems because nobody actually witnessed the crash itself. So in studying the literature, you have to review a lot of the data and, of course, the beliefs that have been injected into the whole conversation. To me, the turning point was, the investigation we did at Trinity with Paola Harris. Paola had started to interview two men who remembered that as children they had seen a crash in 1945, 2 years before Roswell and all the all the explosion of sightings and books in the literature and so on. And the case at Trinity was fascinating to me. She had already done 4 years of research. It was fascinating to me because there were witnesses, and there were the landscape itself sort of spoke about what had happened, with an object coming out of nowhere, hitting a large communication tower, and then crashing on that private ranch. So it had not been spoiled, by a lot of people going over the landscape and so on. That case, as you know, I wrote a book called Trinity that talks about that case and two other cases of, not of crashes, but of landings that had a lot of scientific information attached to them. The case at Trinity, at Valensole, and the case at Socorro, that happened to be official government cases. So taking those three cases together, you can form a good picture of what the craft looks like and what the entities look like. So I think, to me, that is where that's a good starting place for new research, based on what we know now about these that nucleus.
Mm-hmm. Now, I remember when that book came out, and I met Paola. I don't know exactly how you say her name. She lets people call her Paula, but I met her up at Shag Harbor a couple of years ago. Very nice lady. Now, I know that you took a lot of flack for that because a lot of people were saying that wasn't a real event, and I just wonder what makes you convinced. I just wonder what convinced you that this was a real event and really happened.
So when you publish a book, you can't, you have no standing to say, to tell your critics that they're unfair and so on. I mean, you publish the
Yeah.
book, they have a right to criticize it. And one man in particular took the time to do a lot of research into documents. Now, I'm not a document analyst. I'm not doing that. But I've spent a lot of time at the site, and I've spent a lot of time with Paola going over her older records and talking to the witnesses that were there. I think the criticism was fair, frankly, and I have to admit that our critic did a good job of digging up documents that contradicted some of the things in my book. For example, there is a part in the book where I talk about who went back to the crash site when the father of the kid who had seen the crash went to the site with the police, and the name of the policeman that he mentioned was wrong. That our critic found that this man at the same time was still under uniform in Europe. Europe was wrapping up the war, but the troops were still there. So that was right. And obviously his memory was wrong, but when we went back to the story, he had been there. So the story, the facts of the story were correct. The name of the highway policeman was the wrong name. Okay, we found that highway policeman, and he was involved later. But the witness, 50 years later, mixed up the two names.
Sure.
We went to so I did a new edition of the book after researching the case. We found more people who knew about the crash. We found more people who knew about the traces, and we found more people who remembered the whole episode, and they remembered the kids actually showing. There was one panel from the craft blew out when it hit the communication tower. We know where that communication tower was, and we know the whole thing now about the story. There were fragments of fibers that glowed in the dark in different colors and so on. And we found someone who remembered being given some of that to put on a Christmas tree. And I mean, many of the houses didn't have electricity or had electricity only in one room. And the bedrooms were dark, and they used those filaments to put on Christmas tree, and they glowed all night.
Oh my God.
So we found these people, and they remembered that those times and so on. So in the new version of the book, I've gone case by case by case through all the arguments of our critics, and doing additional research. For example, one of the kids, when he grew up, became a businessman in a state where the governor of the state was involved with the Atomic Energy Commission, and she knew about his experience, and he claimed that she showed him a report on the case from the Atomic Energy Commission, because the kids claimed that the object was put on a trailer and taken to Los Alamos. So if there are secrets, they are not in the Pentagon type of secrets. So the normal clearances would not apply unless you have the nuclear clearances, the PQ and other clearances on the nuclear side. Some people in the Pentagon have both, but most people in the military would have no reason, unless they are attached to a unit that has to do with the atomic secrets, no reason to have access to those clearances. So that would explain why, as opposed to Roswell, why the case at Trinity remained so essentially unknown, until Paola Harris did the research at the site. So the new edition answers step by step answers all the questions. So the argument from our critic was that the governor of the state of Washington would never disclose a secret document, that this would be against the law, to one of her constituents, because she was a governor. And that's not true. She did not disclose, she did not give him the report. She didn't tell him what was in the report. She said there was a report on that particular case. It was an official report of the Atomic Energy Commission. So that validation is true. And the critic, went too far. He never said that he had read the report. So we went through every single one of those and explained them. And in the process, Paul Hynek helped us trace another witness who was actually the grandfather, who is still alive. He is in a hospital facility, but his mind is clear. He said, sure. I mean, everybody knew that thing had crashed. So it's funny because Paul asked, well, why didn't you go there? And the man, the old man, poor old man said, look, we had just been bombed by the first nuclear explosion in history. And we had other problems that going into the field to see, a crashed object of some sort. And, people had problems with their family, people had problems with their ranch. And that's where the attention was. But everybody knew about what had happened.
Well, I find that very respectful that you actually, instead a lot of authors may have been a little bit arrogant. Well, this is the way it is, but you actually took the time
But
to do that.
that's fair. That people should criticize. It's not a question of I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, there is this is, what we try to do is science. I mean, in science, you criticize and you don't accept anything as true unless it has been reviewed by your peers and the experiment has been redone in slightly different conditions and so on. But what's interesting in the case at Trinity is that the object was an egg. It was every paper or every book that talks about it shows a disc. The witnesses did not see a disc. They were very clear about the egg shape. They measured it. One of the kids actually pasted it and went inside. So we know a lot about that object. Now, the object at Socorro was egg-shaped, and the object at Valensole was egg-shaped. In all three cases, the beings were similar. They were short, and they were breathing air. They were the size of the kids. They were about 3.5 feet tall, and they were breathing air. Now, what kind of extraterrestrial is that? Okay,
Right.
they did not have a breathing mask.
Always thought of things like that, like wondered how that could possibly be, and if they are breathing air, it would seem like there'd be so many things at risk, for diseases or whatever. Maybe those things don't apply to them or whatever. But yeah, that's always been a puzzle. And here we talk the egg-shaped one, and maybe we'll touch on, Jake Barber's, it wasn't actually his video, but a video that was shown, that was interesting. But here's the thing: when this is back in 1945, and then Cape Girardeau, maybe I'm pronouncing that wrong. Jerry, I can't remember how that's pronounced. Cape 1941. What's it called? Let me just see. Cape Girardeau, something
Yes.
like that. Yeah.
Yes.
But here's the curious thing to me is, we think of Kenneth Arnold as people saying, "Oh, well, the flying saucer era, 1947 June." But this is prior to that. And what did these people, what was their first impression of what they thought they were seeing? I mean, could they go to did they think it was extraterrestrial, or they just were totally puzzled? Do you have any idea?
Well, as you know, I've been criticized by the skeptics, but I've been even more attacked by the ufologists for saying that the phenomenon was not new. That it didn't start at Roswell. It didn't start with Kenneth Arnold, and it certainly didn't start at Trinity either. I think you can go back in history,
Oh yeah.
and I have done that. I wrote a book called Passport to Magonia that went into the history, and more recently, a book looking systematically at cases in the past with a team of experts in researching older archives and in different languages, and Latin and Greek and so on, and we've reconstructed a list of about 500 cases, going back to antiquity, but being very careful to look at the context of every case. And there are the idea of an object crashing and entities interacting with the local population is not new. I mean, it has been in the archives, for a long time. And it's always interpreted sociologically in the context of the time, of course. And for a long time, those gave rise to fairy tales and tales of interacting with the devil and all of that, because it could only be in a religious context. Now it's not in a religious context, it's in a scientific context, but the reactions, the social reactions are similar. So yes, you can go back and you find instances of earlier crashes. The point of pushing the modern era back from 47 to 45 is that 45 was a watershed in history. I mean, the first atomic bomb, the first really major war, that of course after the war in Europe, I learned in school that the war was over when Hitler died. Well, it's not true. The war went on in Japan, went on in the Pacific, and in fact, the major battle of the war was going to be in the north of Japan. So I've read all the new, the most recent history books that have come after the archives have been opened after 50 years. 50 years after the war, all the archives had been reconstructed and were open, and some outstanding books have been published by historians, professional historians, and I've read them. And they paint a completely different picture of the end of World War II and, in the aftermath in America than what I learned in school.
Wow.
So you have to replace the UFO phenomenon into that new picture of what happened after the war and what happened during the war, including the fact that the leading American generals did not want to use the bomb, contrary to what people say. They wanted to go ahead, and and people in Europe say, those Americans, always looking for the newer, bigger thing, and in war and so on. Eisenhower went to see Truman in Washington to tell him that the army did not want to use the bomb. It was President Truman's decision. And what I learned about American history is made more of an impact on me as I was writing that book, with Paolo, than the UFO story itself. I had to relearn really the history of the war, and the history of the country where I was born, and in France, and the history of America. So I think it was a very rich, it's probably the book I've spent the most time on and most attention. I've gone back and forth to New Mexico. I've gotten to know New Mexico pretty well, and it was a very rich experience for me, and I certainly learned a lot about history.
Right. The book you wrote, Wonders in the Sky, love that, with Chris Auerbach, who's been on this show before, and one of my favorite guests. He was really great, and that whole thing. I'm in the antiques world, so history is a big part of that, and I love history, and that book was really quite amazing. And there was the dispelled one that you hear come up now and then, and I'm trying to think of which one. It was Alexander the Great supposedly saw shields in the sky, but that only traces back to 1952 in some novel or something like that. So the research involved in what you did must have been pretty intense for that.
I've got a pretty good library, research library now, and I go back to Europe periodically for my investment work, and I always take the time to visit the libraries and there to look for new material, and it's fascinating to that's something you can learn all along throughout your life, and I'm still learning, and I like that.
Yeah, that's, I love doing this show because there was a point at one time where I was a little bit discouraged, but it was because there was a lot of infighting, which you've seen many times over the years. But other than that, this is just as exciting as when I first started, maybe even more. Well, we're in very interesting times right now. There's so many people that like, oh, you were in this before 2017, like, oh yeah. And it was really, I just want to talk quickly about this, but we were involved in a group situation, you and I and several other people, when it came to the passing of our great friend Lee Spiegel. And I still miss Lee. I think about him all the time. He was such a great spirit. And
I miss him because he was, of course, he single-handedly organized the testimony before the United Nations, way back in '78, and we were still talking about redoing it, and it should be brought to the UN at some point, just to clear all the clutter and so on, and have a clear statement before the world, that this is real, this is happening. I doubt that the UN would actually do very much with it, but they could certainly serve, which is what we proposed, serve as a clearinghouse for people in different nations interested in sharing their information, without the UN investing a lot of money and manpower into the problem itself. But it's an ideal place for people to meet and exchange data, peacefully, because if the phenomenon is what we think it is, then yes, it is potentially a threat, and it's certainly a focus of intelligence and a focus of research for every country, big and small.
Right. I mean, it always, like, just for instance, when there has been issues with disarming nukes and things like that with these, with UFOs involved. How can that not be considered national security? I mean, that's such a big puzzle. Like, I remember the very first hearing they had, the people involved in that, the oversight committee, whatever it was, had no idea about these type of situations that happen. And, it's such a puzzle.
Yes.
Yeah. So going off topic just a little bit, because when the Wilson memo first came out, I was totally thinking it was not right. And, I've gone back and forth, been on the fence over the years about it. And I've never asked you this. What is your opinion of the Wilson memo?
You mean the memo about postponing the Air Force review with the 5 scientists and in the 50s, in the early 50s, there were several things. What happened essentially is that when I was working with Dr. Hynek at Northwestern, I took time during a summer when the university was relatively quiet. I had my PhD in AI of all things, and I was working at the computation center, and I had my office there, and I used my office as a repository for Dr. Hynek's files during the summer to essentially convert everything into computer records. And in the files, there were other things that were not sightings themselves, but were related to the history of the field, memos, correspondence with the Air Force, and so on. And there was a file that had to do with a meeting organized by the Air Force to review its procedures in processing UFO reports, and it was classified at the time. But although a lot of information came out later, and now we know that is the meeting at which, and Dr. Hynek was one of the witnesses. He did not attend all the meetings, but he was called in periodically when they needed his input about the Air Force files. And that's the meeting that decided to split the research on UFOs into 2. First, continue with Project Blue Book, which was unclassified, contrary to what everybody says. They talk about the secret files. They were not secret. The whole idea was this should be public access, and just to monitor what people were seeing and show that the government was open to what the public was reporting. And then there would be a classified high technology approach using instruments, because the idea from the scientists in the group was, no, never mind, we don't need any more cases from somebody who's seen a light outside their window. We want to measure things. We've got instruments now in the Air Force and elsewhere where we can measure the intensity of light, we can track trajectories, we can compute all that, and that's what we should be doing, and that's how we're going to solve the problem. Well, that didn't work, but in the process, the Air Force files blossomed. What people didn't know was that the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus had received a large amount of money for the time to do a catalog of the Air Force files. And they produced a report called Report 14, which was admirable from a computer science point of view. Of course, computer science in those days was fairly primitive, but the statistics were very well developed. And what I found in that file was a two-page letter stamped secret from Battelle to the organizers of the session, of the conference. The conference was inviting the 5 leading physicists in the US, including a Nobel Prize. So this was serious science. It wasn't organized by the Air Force. It was organized by the Air Force on behalf of the CIA. So that was new to me. I had always, everybody has been told in all the published records that this was an Air Force meeting. It was a CIA meeting delegated to the Air Force. The other thing that was shocking was that Battelle wanted to postpone the meeting. They said, "We're not ready. You're calling all these high-level scientists and so on, but we need more time to work on the data to present them with something that's going to be scientifically sufficiently developed for them to put their attention on it and reach some scientific conclusion. It's premature to do it now." Well, the Air Force and their sponsors wanted to get rid of the problem, which was the whole point. And they didn't care. They lied to Nobel Prize in Physics in the process. Now, that was... so I learned a lot by reading that, except that I wasn't supposed to read it. It was secret. So I wasn't going to just, rush and publish it, because I had absolutely no right to do that. And I've always been very respectful. I can't tell the American government what to do with this problem. Okay, that's not my role. My role is as a scientist, and especially as an information science guy, to be part of a team that's going to look at the problem. And I think we can go a long way to helping solve it, helping other people solve it. But there is a community of scientists that has certain rules. So by then, I had been contacted before by someone who worked for Congress, in fact, worked for the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, which is really the top here. I mean, those are the people who can decide what's really going to happen. And he was a legal expert from Washington, and he was working for the chairman of the Intelligence Committee of the Senate. And he contacted me about some other cases that I knew about in Europe, where he wanted to have some corroboration about what had happened. And so after that, I contacted him, because I knew he had told me that he was reviewing yearly, he was reviewing all the classified projects in the Pentagon, in the DOD. So I told him that I had something that I didn't know what to do with, that was stamped secret, and I should be, I invited him to tell me how to treat it. And he said, "Send it to me and I'll tell you." And I sent it to him, and he declassified it so that now everybody can see it. One of the UFO groups, unfortunately, they keep fighting among themselves, and they fight against anyone who doesn't have exactly the same political orientation.
Oh
You'll
yeah.
know that all the wars immediately said that I had invented that whole story. Well, I didn't invent it, because I have, a letter in my files that says that this was declassified and deposited in the archives of the Senate, where everybody can go read it. That memo exists. And it gives it throws an interesting light about the history of the whole field. Because if something like the Robertson panel of Dr. Robertson and its conclusions came from influence from the intelligence community trying to block, not trying to open up the science, but on the contrary, to channel it into areas that could be controlled and essentially hidden from the public, while giving the public a way to report, lights in the sky. That's a historic passage. It's a historic turning point. And it's interesting in asking then, why would they do that? And again, here I'm not jumping to conclusion that they just want to hide it. And I think there is something else. And I think what we see now, under the current administration, keeps reinforcing that idea that there is something else that cannot be told, just cannot be told. And I think at some point, there were 3 times when the subject could have been open. The first time was, in the early 50s. I was still in France in the early 50s as a young astronomer. There were French astronomers who had seen UFOs, and I knew it because I was working at Paris Observatory. It was never published anywhere, but I knew they existed. So I had a friend in the French Air Force, and he had access to the old files of the French Air Force. The French Air Force didn't know what to do with it. So there were about 250 cases, including cases by pilots and so on, in the late 40s and early 50s in France, and have never seen the light of day, still, except
Wow.
in a few cases that I've cited in my books. And this was before the CNES and all the space agency group and so on. So I read all that, and I asked a friend of mine, Aimé Michel, who had done research in France on those cases, why don't they go public about this? I mean, it's really interesting. Scientifically, it's interesting. And he said, well, I have lunch with a French Air Force officer who is in charge of the files, Colonel Clairoy, and I'll ask him, why don't they make this public? So he has lunch with the colonel, and he asks him, and the colonel says, it's a great question. I'm going to look into it. So we'll have lunch a month from now. In France, you always have lunch, when you need to discuss something, usually in a very nice little restaurant somewhere. And so they have lunch again a month later. And Aimé Michel says, well, what did they say? What did your superiors say? He said, I went to see the American embassy, and my counterpart from the American Air Force. And I asked him, why don't you guys, open up the files and on UFOs? And the guy said, look, there are too many things happening in the world. Now, this was the 50s. I mean, this was, the problems with the Soviet Union, the atomic threat, everything else. There are so many things happening in the world. We don't need one more subject that is going to worry everybody where we don't have the answer. So, okay, so there was no disclosure. There could have been a disclosure. If they had disclosed it at the time, there wouldn't have been a big uproar. People would have said that's interesting science. I mean, it's great
Yeah.
if there are life. There were books in those days about life in the universe and so on. That's not new. I mean, this was, there were many books and reports. Going back to Flammarion, in the 19th century and all that. I mean, in France, that was a common topic in science. It wasn't a big thing. And I wonder why it's a big thing today in the US. I mean, this has been, obviously one of the great subjects in science. So,
Hmm.
so that died, and everything went underground. At the Robertson panel could have opened it up. I mean, they could have said, "Look, they had a Nobel Prize. They had 4 of the leading physicists in the country who had worked on the bomb with Oppenheimer, who had been there, had been part of the American effort to win the World War II. They had enormous prestige. They could have opened up the files. Battelle had done an exceptional job of documenting everything, all the statistics that could have been published instead of being closed again and kept secret for so long. Why they didn't do it? Well, again, I think they will live to regret it, not opening it, because then people were talking about, going into space, satellites, and so on. It was, 3 years later, 1957, Sputnik.
Yeah.
People were ready for that. It
Hmm.
was exciting. We were going to go into the universe and eventually to the moon. Eventually, man would fly in space and so on. So, but instead, they were afraid of the subject, of what public opinion would do with it, and they clamped it down um, against the advice of Battelle itself, their own consultant. Okay. Um, then, at the time of the Condon report could very much have said, look, there is something there. In fact, Professor Condon, whom I got to know and respect on a personal basis with Dr. Hynek, we were the first ones to testify before the Condon Committee
Wow.
in Boulder. Uh,
Hmm.
did say that there was a problem there, that not everything was explained, but that there were more important things in science, and that this was, a secondary subject that wasn't very important, and that it could be dismissed by, in terms of American science. Uh, but, if you read the whole thing, 1/3 of the reports that they investigated is unidentified. 1/3.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
Nobody reads the appendix. Okay. They read the conclusions, and then they read what the New York Times says about it. And the New York Times said there's nothing to UFOs. And that killed the subject for 10 years.
Hmm.
I mean, it killed it. So, I mean, at that point, I gave up on American science, and I had offers to, go back to France, and I went back. My wife and I took our kid, and we went back to France. Um, and then,
So this in the
then I
70s.
came back because
Yeah.
things changed. But
Oh, yeah.
essentially, I was just completely disgusted with the whole thing. It seemed completely closed, as it seems now. I mean, we're back to those days. So
What do you,
there have been those 3 cases where it could have been honestly opened with the truth told to people, namely that we've got a phenomenon that's very, very big, and that we don't understand the first thing about it. I mean, that's the truth. Okay, it's in one sentence. Dr.
yeah.
Hynek had remained, close to, of course, Project Blue Book, and uh, some of the officers from the Air Force who led Project Blue Book. The one that he respected the most was a man named Major Friend, who was a black officer from the Air Force, who was, in Dr. Hynek's estimation, the most dedicated man who led the Air Force study. And he went back to Major Friend and asked him, look, I don't have the clearances you have, but, tell me, what does this whole thing mean? And Major Friend smiled, and he said it can only mean one of two things. Either they know what it is, or they don't know what it is. And that was just so perfect, and it's true today. I mean, what's going on with Congress and with the hearings and all these pilots standing up in front of the committee and so on? Well, it means either they know what it is, so they won't tell it, or they don't know what it is and they will pretend they know what it is.
Yeah.
And that's where we're still at that stage. So come on, I mean, let's level with the people and tell them this is new. We don't have any idea what it really is in the big system of things, and we need more scientists involved all over the world, not just closed up with secrets and piles of secrets that are essentially, when you get to the bottom of that columns of secrets, there's nothing. There is a big question mark. The big question mark is the most secret thing.
Well, unfortunately, we only have like 4 minutes or so, but something I've said a number of times in the show, and I just wondered if you agree with my thoughts or not. I do believe, well, let's talk about the United States government, and this is just my own theory. I do believe that they know more than we do, or some part of it knows more than we do about what's going on. But my thoughts is that they do not have the full picture. And because they do not have the full picture, how can they possibly say that they can protect us from it or it's not dangerous? So I just wondered, do you think that might be a fair statement, or how do you feel about that?
I don't think it's one thing. The topic can be looked at and can be classified in different things. I think what they are looking at is what the military is looking at. I mean, all the people who are emerging before Congress and so on are are people who are in uniform or were recently in uniform running different projects. Some of them classified and some of them still classified. But those projects had to do with gathering information from Air Force facilities, from radar, from pictures, not pictures, but images, infrared images, and the like, which is, it's natural to keep that somewhat classified because the technologies themselves are classified. So that's in a complex thing. There is, what about all the cases of the farmer in the field who sees something land and, he's going to call me because he's heard of my books, and I go there and he shows me the traces and he tells me the whole story. I mean, that's, and I've gone, all the way through Utah from north to south and east and west, talking to ordinary people, not just on the Bigelow Ranch, all over the northern half of Utah, with Professor Salisbury twice a whole week at the time, talking to witnesses and having lunch with them and going over what they had seen. We only published a small sample of all that. It's all there, and that's not secret. I mean, I can take you there. And then there are the medical aspects that are not clear, they have been researched, but the research has not been published, and it should be pursued. Of course, it cannot, the names of people cannot be published because are under HIPAA and so on. But I've been part of enough medical research teams to tell you there are ways of extracting that information and actually publishing it for your colleagues and for other hospitals and so on. That has not been done. Okay, so that's, you know, that should be open. And then there are the impact on consciousness, on religion that
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Kreipel has preserved,
Right.
you know, at
Yep.
Rice University, and
Yes.
all of that. I mean, that is open. People can go there. My files I will be open in due time, because I think they would serve no purpose in the current, you know, confusion right now. But eventually, they are in good shape and they can be open. So it's not a question that this is all secret. You know, people know about this. People
Yes.
have seen those things all over the world. You know,
Right.
you can go to Egypt and talk to people about it. You can go to Russia and talk to people about
Right.
it. They know.
Yeah.
That I went to Russia. I found a kid who had translated 2 of my books into Russian. You
Wow.
know, they were in samizdat form, but people were reading them. He never
Yeah.
asked permission. I mean, I would have given him permission,
Yeah.
but you know, those things circulate. People translate it themselves and give it to their friends.
That's great.
So it's wonderful.
Yes, and I hate to say this, we're out of time because I feel like we just scratched the surface. And if it wasn't a hard
We
out
can
here on
redo it.
KGR, yeah, if it wasn't a hard out on,
We'll see if I change your mind.
yeah, no, it was great. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. And please, for those people watching live, jump over to the John Kiriakou stream. That's up next. And thank you so much, Jacques. It's been a real pleasure. Always wonderful talking to you. Again, this could be 4 hours, and I don't think we'd just get started. But thanks again. All right, everyone, jump over to the next stream, and remember to keep your eyes to the sky. We'll be back next week as well.